Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Merit Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion with our very special guest, Sir Jeremy Farrar, Director of the Wellcome Trust. Jeremy, it's wonderful to have you here today. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. Very, very grateful that you're here. As director of the Wellcome Trust, Sir Jeremy leads the world's second largest independent charitable foundation that exists to improve human health through research. And he also has served as chair of the World Health Organization's R&D Blueprint, which activates rapid research in an epidemic, and is a member of the UK's Pandemic Advisory Group called the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, SAGE. Before joining the Wellcome Trust in 2013, he was for 18 years director of the Clinical Research Unit for Tropical Diseases in Vietnam, and there his research interests were in global health and focused on emerging infectious diseases, and that brought him into extensive experience with SARS in Asia. He's here today to speak about his remarkable new book, Spike, the Virus versus the People. I want to show you, I have a copy. I have read it with enormous interest. And it's characterized as a pulse racing journey through the science and politics of the pandemic and the decisions or the lack of decisions made by the government of the UK during this COVID-19 pandemic. It's been a top 5 Sunday Times bestseller called The Searing Indictment of the Government's Serial Failures to Follow the Science. And, you know, we hope to discuss all that. We're a school here at SIPA of global public policy. We think about global problems, national responses, and global responses. Many of our faculty work on health economics development. We closely collaborate with the School of Public Health. And at this time when the world's interconnectedness is so obvious and the difficulties of doing that around what would seem an inescapable issue affecting us all, we're very, very grateful to have this time to talk about these things with you. Sir Jeremy was one of the very first people in the world to know about and alert the global community to COVID-19. And joining us in this conversation are two remarkable experts at Columbia. I want to start with Wafaa El-Sadr. Professor El-Sadr is a university professor, the highest recognition we give at Columbia University, a professor of epidemiology and medicine. She is also director of Columbia World Projects, director of ICAP, director of this health initiative that's really a global leader in addressing HIV and global health threats. I also want to acknowledge at Columbia University during this pandemic, Dr. El-Sadr has really played a crucial role with our COVID-19 task force, designing our own response at Columbia to keep our communities safe, to develop our own protocols, working with the city. And we are all deeply grateful to you, Wafaa, for your leadership and contributions during this period. I'm also pleased to welcome Wilmot James, who is chair of a new pandemic research center and senior research scholar at the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, ICERP, at Columbia University. He previously served as a member of Parliament in South Africa and as the Shadow Minister of Health. Thank you, Wilmot, for joining us as well. Jeremy, if I could invite you to start us off very broadly, can you tell us what you really want the reader to take away from this really gripping work that you have done called Spike, that's also very readable and yet has enough science so someone who's hungry for it can learn from it? What did you want your readers to take from it?
So firstly, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure, but also an honor to join you. And the links between the Columbia and Wellcome are, of course, growing at the moment as well. You've been very kind to us as you've tried to, you've advised us about our work on climate change and health. And it's a pleasure to join you. The book is the catalyst and the stimulus for us getting together, but I hope the conversation goes beyond the book itself to the broader issues that I think it raises for all of us. It's bizarre to say that here we are in September 2021, somewhat 19-20 months into the pandemic, with a truly horrific impact on everything: health, education, economies, trade, debt, remittances, development, geopolitics. And yet still I've had a sense for a long time, I still have it today, that in some ways, as we live through it, we almost don't quite yet appreciate the potential implications of it. I'm an avid lover of history, and 100 years on from 1918, we still discuss what happened, what decisions were made that were good, what were bad, what were the lessons learned from it, and how could things have been done better pre-1918 and after 1918. And I think that will be true of this event as well. There are many, many lessons to learn. And I, as I thought about this, and I should pay tribute to my co-author, Janow, who played such a critical role in putting the book together, there is a danger, I think, that in the optimism that humanity has, we move on too quickly, that we actually forget the lessons, that the political history of it gets rewritten, our memories fade, we move on to other things. And I think that would be an absolute tragedy and would be disrespectful to the millions of people, maybe as many as 15, 16 million people now around the world who have lost their lives, and I'm afraid to say many more to come. So it was to sort of frame it scientifically, politically, policy-wise, in where I think the pandemic is and will be in the future. And I hope to learn some lessons as a sort of contemporary record rather than in retrospect.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. That's a helpful framing. The book starts, as you described, the early signs of the pandemic and trying to piece together what you were hearing and what that meant for the world. Could you take us into that moment and what you feel at that moment, perhaps what should have been, if you will, the world coming together, or China reacting differently, or the world picking up clues differently? Could you speak to the origins issue? By that I mean both the world's response, as well as, if I may, the origins question, which we're still debating in the United States. I mean, was it from nature, or was it a laboratory accident? Your book is pretty fascinating around that whole question, because it seems like you were leaning in one direction at one point about a lab, but then you, I think, seem to rule that out and land on really that it was from nature being the simplest explanation. We're still debating that, trying to get science around that. So I guess I'm asking you two questions bundled. One are the signs and how the world could have been made alert more quickly, and then second, where you think this came from.
Yeah, I think I at this stage, even now, September 21, I don't actually think you can rule anything out at the moment. I think it remains unanswered. I think there are very strong scientific evidence of leaning in one direction, but I don't think you can rule anything out. And I'll come back to why I think that's true. Yes, I was involved from, I think, the 30th or 31st of December. It depends on the time zone you're talking about. I was coming back from Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where involved in the Ebola vaccine work of the epidemic in North Kivu, which was still going on and which continued through into 2020. But really, I think there was a few critical periods in this pandemic, and the period pre-December is a really important phase that we should never forget. And that is that over the course of the last 20 years, I go back to an outbreak of something called Nipah virus in 1999 in Malaysia, now endemic in Bangladesh. And since 1999, 20 years, almost exactly to the day or month, the world has seen a series of national or regional or global very disruptive, very frightening, and worrying epidemics, or indeed pandemics. And you can map them out: Nipah, SARS-1, H5N1, H7N9, H1N1. We had MERS, we had now SARS-2, of course, we had Zika, we had Ebola, and others. And frankly, they all had similar patterns. Viruses, mostly viruses in the animal kingdom, coming across into the human population and expanding and amplifying in the big cities that many of us now live in, and then through trade and travel spreading around the world. These all driven indeed by ecological environment change and climate change, land use change. So these are all features of the 21st century, and they're not going away. The environment change, the climate change, ecological change, land use, urbanization, changing relationship with animals and humans. This is why we're now in what I think is truly a pandemic era. And we didn't heed the warnings. We didn't make the investments in global institutions. We didn't make the investments in public health. We allowed degrees of inequality within our countries and between our countries to get to a level that is non-sustainable. And so the drivers of COVID-19, I think, just are symptomatic of the 21st century. In December and January, there is no doubt there were delays which we must not let happen in the future. The first few hours and days of the emergence of an epidemic are critical. You can stop things happening, and many things have been prevented in the last 20 years, but you have to act quickly. You have to act in ways that are stronger, deeper, geographically more distributed than you think are needed. And you have to make decisions in the absence of certainty. And that is very hard to do. And it's frightening. And so often it occurs at Christmas, at Chinese New Year, at Eid, at Passover. It occurs at times of the year when people are distracted and they don't want to think about it. This happened building up to both the New Year and also the Chinese New Year. And secondly, we don't have our political systems and public health infrastructure that can report those in the time frame that's required. If there was an outbreak of a few people with pneumonia in one district of New York, and a few days later, 1 or 2 people in a different hospital, and then a lot of people in their primary care were getting sick or off work, how quickly would we pick that up in New York or London or Wuhan? But undoubtedly, as well as that chaotic public health system, there were delays that led to a worsening of the situation as a result of delays in diagnosing and then reporting through the structures in China. And I think that delayed things by 2 to 3 weeks. I don't think it was much longer than that, but up to less than a month, I think, was released. But then critically, on the 20th of January, 10th of January, we had the genome release sequence, and I documented in the book how that happened. And then on the 20th of January, there were reports of this infection being asymptomatically transmitted between human beings across geographical areas, and for which we had no drugs, no diagnostic test, and no vaccine, and probably no immunity. We knew enough on the 24th of January in the public domain to be able to prepare as countries. And frankly, the delays in China were then amplified around the world as countries thought they were exceptional. They wouldn't suffer from the same things suffered in Asia. There's a degree of cultural racism, I think, and countries did not use that 2 or 3 month period that we had in January, February, and March to prepare adequately. And the lesson for me is you've got to act before you're certain. You've got to act with uncertain data. And the decision not to make a decision is a decision in itself with repercussions. Mm-hmm. On the origins, yes, this started in Wuhan, where there's a well-documented category 4, BSL-4 facility, Wuhan Institute of Virology. And when I first heard about this, I think put 2 and 2 together and got 5 or 6. I worked through January, February, and into March independently with a group of scientists from the US and from Europe and from Australia and Singapore indeed. And over time, that 3 month period, my scientific rationale changed. And I think 18 months later, I think the weight of evidence is that this was a natural origin of a emergence of a new virus from the animal kingdom that come across into humans. There is still, I think, a small possibility that this was a lab accident or other. And I would call on all people involved, Chinese authorities, the World Health Organization, the US government, everybody, to try and work together to get to the bottom of it. I think the scientific evidence today suggests a natural origin, but we cannot rule out a lab escape. And just finally, if I may, just to finish that off, we should also ask, is the world safer today? And the truth is that international cooperation and collaboration on zoonotic pathogens today is at its most fragile and highest risk of any time in my career. International cooperation has all but stopped. We don't have a handle on what's circulating in the animal kingdom almost anywhere in the world, but particularly in Asia. And I think if we allow this geopolitical impasse to go on for very much longer, we are at grave risk of something happening and we would not know about it. And I think that's a very, very dangerous position to be in.
Thank you. Thank you for addressing so many of these dimensions and particularly putting it in the bigger historical and institutional context. Take us into the UK for a minute, if you would. A lot of your book focuses on some of the actions and mistakes, in your view, that occurred in the United Kingdom, and the responses around the world have each been so different and distinct. Could you share with us what you think was particularly troubling from your, or useful? You know, what caused things to move ahead? You know, why was the institutions struggling to accept this reality? Could you take us a little bit more into the UK response and what you think drove the dynamic in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I think there are many parallels actually between the United Kingdom and the United States of America in many of these, as actually there are in many other countries. I think I sort of break it up into maybe three areas. One is the time period January to March, where I think the risk and the threat of this and the potential impact was underestimated. I think there was a sense in the UK, but I'd be interested in your view of the United States, of what I call the exceptionalism, either arrogant exceptionalism or whatever, but exceptionalism. It wouldn't be the same in UK. We had a very strong healthcare system, a primary healthcare system, a proud track record of public health and strong institutions. And I think we underestimated the power of an asymptomatic human-to-human transmission of a respiratory virus. And frankly, I don't think we used that first 10 weeks or so of January, February, and March as well as we should have done. And I think we were not ready to make decisions, really difficult decisions, early enough. Italy, France locked down about 10 days before the UK, and I think Britain delayed for 10 days. And I think that led to a significant number of people dying that did not have to die. And I think some of that might resonate with the United States as well in January, February, March. I think later, though, Britain got into a better position, and I think the scientific advice into government became stronger. But for me, the period January, February, March, you could almost, if you're being charitable, say, well, none of us knew what was coming. And to some degree, that would be true. I think my biggest frustration was that come to the fall of 2020, August, September, October, frankly, when the data in the United Kingdom was extraordinarily strong data, from genomics to public health, to clinical illness, to every level of the health system and education and everything else. And yet we had the data and we watched things get worse. And I think if I could be charitable in January, February, March, my charity ran out in September, October, when I felt we were watching an impending crisis unfold with beautiful, amazing data. And we chose not to act, or we chose to not make a decision and delayed. And I think as a result, we suffered a dreadful December, January, February of 2021. And I think many tens of thousands of people tragically died in that period. And I think at least some of that could have been avoided. I think the strengths, to now go on to the more optimistic, positive note, I think the way that the British system has its scientific advice with contemporary scientists embedded within every single government ministry all of the time, not in a crisis, they're there all of the time. They're networked with the British chief scientist, Patrick Vallance, and feed into the chief medical officer, Chris Whitty. I think that is a very strong structure. I'd like to see it used more. I'd like to see it gaining more authority, I suppose. And I think it's a structure to build on, not discard. I think it's a very powerful structure. And I'm very pleased, for instance, in the United States to now see a scientist now at cabinet level within the Biden administration, which I think is a very, very positive move forward.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But before bringing in our distinguished colleagues, let me invite you to, if you would, comment on what your assessment is now of the current trajectory of COVID-19, you know, both in the developed countries as well as more globally, and if there are thoughts about, are we any better off preparing? I think your book ends with sort of looking to the future and wanting us to draw lessons both for institutions and the relationship between science and policy. So we're still in a moment of a terrible moment around the world, around COVID-19 and within our own countries, much to do. So how was your assessment of this time and how prepared we are for going forward globally?
So I think the world is now almost is essentially divided into those with access to the tools required and those without. That's true at a community level as well as at a national level. And the biggest factor, but it's not the only factor, but the biggest sort of single factor in that, of course, is access to vaccines. And I think those countries with good access, good availability, and the ability to roll those vaccines out are now in a phase of transition from epidemic, pandemic into endemic. This virus is not going away. This is now a human virus, I think, with humanity for a very long time or forever. I think it's now a human endemic infection. But I think countries with access to vaccines, United States, UK, Europe, are now in a transition phase. And that transition phase will be from where the transmission in the community is very high, and it causes a great deal of illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. That's the pandemic phase. The vaccines have reduced illness, hospitalizations, and deaths dramatically. They're incredibly safe. They're incredibly effective at preventing you getting sick, of going to hospital and dying, but only if you get them. The vaccines are less good at stopping transmission. So they're not building up population immunity in quite the same way as with, for instance, the measles vaccine and others. The vaccines clearly wane over time, and they clearly benefit the individual as well as the community, but the weight of benefit is towards those people vaccinated. So the most important thing we can do now is offer vaccines and get vaccines to as many people as we can the world over. And we would be better to make vaccines equitably available around the world than we would to vaccinate everybody in a small number of countries. And I'm afraid the world is dividing into those that have and those that have not. And I don't think that is a moral or ethically good position to be in. It also doesn't make any scientific or public health sense. The transition phase that United States, UK is in now, I think will be highly variable around the world. I'll pick out Denmark as being a country that I think will transition quickly. High degree of capacity in the health system, a high degree of a very strong social contract, not very much inequality, and trust in authority, and vaccine uptake extraordinarily high. I think Denmark will transition quite quickly. I think the UK will transition reasonably quickly. My worry for the United States, and I'm obviously an outsider, is even at the moment, you still have 70 million people not vaccinated. That's a very large number of people when you have a Delta variant with its high transmission. So I think countries with access to vaccines need to use them. But the second thing, and perhaps the biggest scar really on humanity at the moment, is the vaccine inequity, or as some have called it, vaccine apartheid. And with rates of vaccination in some countries at 90% and in other countries at 1 or 2%, that is an unacceptable place for the world to be in. And it'll be a very difficult world to bring together to address other great challenges of our time if we allow that degree of inequity to continue. So I think we should be planning now for the transition. I think we should be planning for an endemic infection. We need to invest in science to provide second and third generation vaccines and treatments. And we need to make sure we reduce the vaccine inequity that is globally making the pandemic longer than it needs to be.
Thank you very much. Let me invite Dr. El-Sadr to join this conversation, if I may. Wafaa, please, thank you again for joining us, and let me invite you to take this forward in any direction you'd like.
Yeah, I think, and thank you very much, Merit, and thank you, Jeremy and Wilmot. And I think it's interesting to me to reflect on this pandemic, because I think a distinguishing feature is that actually it has affected some of the wealthiest, most best resource countries in the world. I mean, the US continues to lead in terms of numbers of cases. UK is way up there, and several countries in Western Europe and so on. And these are the same countries that were initially judged to be best prepared. And that's kind of an interesting irony. And so it makes me wonder whether, as we're focusing now on responding to this pandemic, whether we should at the same time not lose the opportunity to focus on preparedness. I feel like I worry, as Jeremy mentioned, is that people have short memories, and we should use this moment to reflect on really all the investments in preparedness that were put in several of the countries I mentioned, and try to understand why weren't we well prepared? What happened here? What are the failures? Otherwise, we are likely for history to repeat itself in many ways. So I would urge that we grab this moment and do really a very careful postmortem, not just in terms of the response, but also in terms of our preparedness. So that would be one thought that I would add to Jeremy's. I think the other is in a lot of ways, the lessons learned. And I think reading your book, Jeremy, highlighted the very similar mistakes that were made in the United States in a lot of ways. And I think from day one, it's been, the politicization of the epidemic and politicization of the response to the epidemic. Simple things like masking and curfews and so on became a political battle rather than a public health conversation. Another is who is the spokesperson? Who is the person up front who's talking about this pandemic in your country and our country? And unfortunately, often it was more the politicians rather than public health voice. And what you really ideally need is to have a consistent, trusted public health voice that's supported by the political leadership behind the scenes. And I think we flipped this I feel, anyway, I know the US more than the UK, but I think we flipped this, and we often had the political voice and the public health expertise was way in the background. And I think that was to our disadvantage. And I think that's why we in many ways, we jeopardized that confidence that we needed in the population, whether it be in the confidence in terms of the masking and effectiveness of masking, the confidence in the vaccines, the confidence in all the other measures. I think we made that mistake, I think, and we're paying the price. And I think thirdly is maybe, and that's my last point, is the issue of dealing with communicating uncertainty. And it's a very complicated, communicating risk and communicating uncertainty is very complex. And I think the other important principle is that to always be anchoring our pronouncements in the moment, to always say, this is what we know today, but we know that science changes. We know that tomorrow we may have something new information, and we may have to revisit what I'm just saying now. And I think we sometimes made these pronouncements that seem to be kind of forever. And we know very well that science is not forever, that there are discoveries and so on that will often and should often inspire us to change our mind and have a new message. And I feel that was also contributed in some ways to the loss of confidence of the population as we were dealing with this pandemic in real time.
Yeah, if I could just comment briefly on those, I absolutely agree with everything you said. I think trusted and respected institutions and organizations are, and people, of course, are critical. The US, the Center for Disease Control over the last 50 years has been the standout public health body globally. And yet at times in the last maybe 5 or 10 years, it's been undermined at some times. And I think if you undermine your critical institutions, I'm a doctor, so Center for Disease Control, but I'm sure it's true in the judiciary, I'm sure it's true in the education system. If you undermine your institutions, those institutions may not be there when you need them. They may not be trusted by the society. So I think what you have before you go in, it was very interesting the way New Zealand handled it, as you rightly say, about science advice into government, the way Norway, Denmark, to a degree Singapore, to a degree Vietnam, I think handled it very different. And there are lessons to be learned from all of those. It's also important that scientists appreciate their role in this. Ultimately, democratically or non-democratically, people in control of countries, the politicians do need to own the final decisions. Science is there to offer advice. And there's a very difficult relationship, as I've found, and I think some of it comes out in the book, between independent scientific advice and policy decisions. Where does your responsibility lie? Where does it stop? What are you free to speak to? If you disagree with policy decisions, what's your responsibility to speak out? And that's a very, very difficult relationship. And I think universities, and Columbia are a great example of this, has got a critical role to play in the next coming years, next decade, thinking how does science inform policy? Where is its line? Where is its demarcation between advice and decision making? And this is going to be a vexed issue in all sorts of issues going forward. And the last thing I'd mention, I think, is inequality. Yes, in the joint evaluation exercise for the United States and the UK, both countries apparently did well, and yet both countries have not come out of this well. And I think it's because we underestimated political decision making. We underestimated the inequality in front of our eyes all of the time, and we brushed over it, and we did some technical scoring without appreciating that public health is everything. Inequality, vaccines, trust, communication, society, community, language, it's all of this. And you cannot just push it down to a technical expert, ticking a series of boxes and getting to a score. It's much broader than that.
Thank you very much. I hope we can come back to these points in a few minutes, but let me invite Wilmot James into this conversation. I know he's been working at the global level and also with the government of South Africa. Wilmot.
Thank you very much, Merit and Wafaa and Jeremy. Let me just echo Merit's comment about the book Spike, in that it is a tribute to what we can call the public understanding of science. You remember Richard Dawkins' chair at Oxford was called the Simone Public Understanding of Science Chair. It's not a book in a dumbing down of science. It's really important to emphasize that it's a wonderful book to read, and you tell the story in a manner that promotes a public understanding of science. And yet you tell the story also well. And clearly working with a journalist would have been a very nice iterative engagement for you around that. So congratulations for the book. It's very readable, and it's about a monumental catastrophe. I wanted to explore two issues with you. The first, just very directly, is that you make the case for having a more muscular WHO. And obviously, for it to be more muscular, it requires a different financing model. I spent 12 years on the board of the Ford Foundation, and we had, like the Wellcome Trust, like Gates Foundation, an endowment, which gives you that freedom to pursue a course of action that is informed by the right sets of advice. So I wanted to hear from you what your reflections on what that alternative financing model is for the WHO to make it more muscular and independent, and whether there's room to talk about an endowment that in certain specific functions of the WHO, there ought to be an endowment. And then the question is, how is that put together? I had a second issue, which I like to pursue when it comes to China and the United States collaborating at this time. I mean, during the height of the Cold War, when it came to existential threats, there was cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States, even though they were enemies on all other manner of fronts. But on that question, there was cooperation because it was a threat to humankind. If that same approach was taken right now between China and the United States, is to define this as an existential threat and to cooperate. We know the projections for vaccines, for example, for next year is by the middle of next year, there probably will be 3 times as many vaccines in the world than what there are now, and even more. And that most of the vaccines will come out of China, and therefore, together with the ones out of exist. So I just like to have your reflections on the politics of what it is you're doing, the global politics. And whether we should make a strong push globally for better Chinese-USA cooperation on this particular question.
Yeah, so some huge issues there, which, and thank you for your comments again about the book. And I just reiterate the tribute to Anjana Ahuja, who's a brilliant writer as well as a journalist and a superb listener as well, which is a great skill. Firstly, WHO. I'd be interested in all of your views, but if I look back over my career, whatever it is, 30 years or so, I think WHO has been at its best when it's been, frankly, the place to go if you were young and ambitious and bright and really good at what you did, from epidemiology to communications, etc. I think there was a period, perhaps of this century, actually, when some of that was lost, and people stayed within their universities, understandably. They came to philanthropy, Wellcome or Gates or anybody else. I would like to see the WHO, its regional offices, its country offices and its headquarters, again, becoming the place to go to for really talented individuals. The mandate it has from its member states is, of course, its great strength, but it's also becoming increasingly its weakness, because that mandate comes, I think, too often with promises that are not kept on funding, and an attempt to use the WHO and other UN agencies as a political football to use as a default to go to play out other tensions between countries. And I would dearly love to see the WHO, if you like, moved above politics, but that goes to US CDC, it goes to European CDC as well. The danger that Wafaa talked about the politicalization of public health is a very dangerous precedent. And I'd love to see, but I'm not overly optimistic that we'll be able to move the WHO into that sort of space. I think there are some solutions that might help alongside it. I think your idea of an endowment is a really interesting one. I've not actually heard that as an idea before. I think through a multilateral financial institute, whether the IMF or the World Bank, such a system could work, which countries could have trust in, and that they could have a mandate to the Director General, for instance. Personally, I would move the Director General to having a single 7 or 8 year term rather than having to go to re-election. I think the re-election gives the member states of the WHO almost a totally controlling influence over the Director General. It's not just Dr. Tedros, it's every Director General in the past. If they have to go up for re-election in only 3 or 4 years' time, they have to be very careful what they say to blocks of countries and to individual countries. And they are caught in this crossfires of geopolitics. So properly funded through, I hate to use the phrase global taxation, but in the end, that's ultimately what it comes down to. The rich countries inevitably paying more in some progressive way. An endowment is a really nice idea so that it could be planned longer term rather than year to year, month to month, which is what the WHO currently got into. And then I would have the Director General with a single 7 or 8 year term to release him or her from the need to be re-elected. And I think that would give a strong degree of independence. On the China-US, I mean, this is above my pay grade and expertise, but I wouldn't discount the window we've got. We all know the politics of the last 5 years and the tensions between certain administration in the United States, but elsewhere as well, and towards China. We've got to hope that the current administration can act like the broker that happened in previous administrations to China, and that China will reciprocate and lead that process as well in those issues where there has to be cooperation. If China and the US want to compete about trade and manufacturing and other issues around the global finances, I don't think we'll be able to stop that, or around information technology and the divide in IT and digital. But around things which are existential threats to both and all the rest of us, I think the coming together of rapprochement between China and the US is absolutely critical. And especially to you, Wilmot, and the role of South Africa here, I think if countries can't perhaps sometimes come together, maybe there's a need for an interlocutor there, an interlocutor of respected country that isn't a threat to either pole, but represents a broader voice and says, you need to come together. And maybe China and the US would struggle to do that for all sort of domestic and international political issues. Maybe South Africa, maybe Norway, maybe Egypt, maybe Brazil or Argentina. I think we might need somebody to try and bring together. There was a brilliant play I watched recently called Oslo. If anybody has a chance to watch it, please go and see it. At the role that Norway played in trying to bridge the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And I think that just demonstrated that sometimes you do need a friend of both of you to bring you together. So maybe that's a role for you, Wilmot, if Colombia will let you go, and Wafaa, maybe for you as well.
I did watch that play in New York, and it is magnificent, I have to say. You made me think of something, Jeremy, which is, I mean, WHO is really supposed to be a normative agency. And I feel like actually in the response to COVID-19, if we put aside the whole issue around the origin of the virus and so on, the other work of WHO has been quite impressive. You know, some of the groups they put together, some of the support for some of the research that's been done. I think it's been really putting out guidelines, because I can see that from all the countries where we work, and I can see how the guidance is very helpful and people are using it. So is it that we need to kind of maybe, and I don't want to dig deep into WHO, but to think carefully about what is the role of the WHO, and isn't it really a normative agency, and that there should be some other kind of a structure that actually tackles the implementation of a response, more or less.
Yeah, I think this is again, you know, Columbia and universities, I think, have got a really important role to play in debating and discussing this, and providing the intellectual underpinning of that sort of structure. I agree with you. I think WHO, in the circumstances, has done a truly remarkable job. I mean, the WHO R&D blueprint team pulling together the meeting in February 2020, which essentially said to the world, we're in this together, and we need to share the technical expertise, and whether it's on vaccines or tests or treatments, we need to have approaches that are agnostic to geography and cross-border, and it hasn't all been successful, but you know, that was a pivotal February meeting which brought people together and deserve great credit. I think the normative functions are absolutely critical. They are the centerpiece of what the WHO and the guidance they've issued, whilst we may not agree with every single word of it, have been incredibly influential in guiding countries who might not have all the access to data that US has or somebody else, but nevertheless can look at what is the best practice around the world and can share that through a single agency and provide those sorts of guidelines where there may not otherwise exist. I think the challenge for the WHO is often it gets itself, even though it may not want to, dragged into other things because nobody else is doing them. And remember what we've gone through in the last 2 years, where Merit said it earlier, where countries, rich countries, and the poorest country world have all had the same problem at the same time. That has meant that many countries have been on their own. You know, if it wasn't happening in the United States, I bet the US CDC would be playing a much bigger role internationally, but it's had so many issues to deal with domestically that, and then WHO has to step into that, because in the absence of WHO, who would it be? What I would caution against, and this has been a big issue working within the ACT Accelerator, is fragmentation. I think I would be cautious about setting up new institutions. In fact, I would, as I said in the final book chapter, I would consolidate some of the institutions and either align them more closely or merge them even. And obviously, I have huge respect for Gavi and the Global Fund. They've transformed health around the world. But are those very strong vertical systems now fit for purpose when the science will be taking us into a more horizontal world and public health is horizontal? So can we retain the benefits, the vertical benefits of Gavi, Global Fund and others? And can we evolve them into playing a greater horizontal role in public health? And I think that is an important question for the future. But I wouldn't establish more and more agencies, all of which will have their own brand, have their own replenishments, have their own competition with each other sometimes. I would look to consolidate. And I think that might improve the delivery of those agencies within national capitals and communities around the world as well by having a less fragmented structure.
May I ask you a question on that one? I mean, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying, but it's also true that, you know, pre-pandemic, what we've seen is the growth of private philanthropies, private foundations that have made, you know, massive investments, and a real difficulty of international organizations coming together that seems to remain to be the case. I'm thinking, you know, here we have the upcoming COP, we have the WTO ministerial, you know, you have Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, well known to us, you know, who understands these problems, wants to work on them from the WTO, the World Bank trying to play a role, the IMF as well, and clearly contributing, but you know, struggling to find, I think, ways of coming together and in member-driven organizations that have to reach consensus among their members on policies going forward. So while that's very, I think it's a powerful argument you're making, it's operationally very, very challenging. So I'm just wondering if there is an enhanced role, if not a fragmented role, that could be played, knowing where institutions are able to move more nimbly than others. Do you think about, how do you think about that challenge of your own foundation or others working with these institutions in new ways, rather than trying to create a WHO, for example, that maybe becomes fundamentally empowered in ways it's had difficulty being empowered, I guess?
Yeah, there is an absolute balance. My view is we do need both, whether it's the university sector, who have played around the world a remarkable contribution in this pandemic, which must be stated. I mean, the university sector around the world has really stepped up, whether in science or policy or thinking about the broad approach, and to be hugely congratulated. Yeah, philanthropy can play its role, industry can play its role, but what we shouldn't get carried away with is their scale. They seem big, you know, the Gates Foundation seems big, Wellcome might seem big to some, but the reality is, I think this absolutely has a prime responsibility to the public funds and frankly to governments. Yes, industry can play a role and has done, but governments really play the tune. And what I would like to avoid, and this is partially in the book, is the fact that government sort of looking through, often for domestic political reasons, look to blame somebody else. It's easy to blame somebody else. It's easy to say, oh, the WHO have been useless, Global Fund have been useless, World Bank hasn't been quick enough, IMF didn't step up. To some degree, some of the criticism is fair, but I think some of it has also been countries trying to deflect their own mistakes and problems and said, we did okay, it was them over there that was the problem. And I think all of these agencies, from the UN agencies to the Global Fund and the rest, they are all dependent on a slightly odd relationship with governments. They can't criticize governments because they have their funding comes from governments. I'd like to see a greater degree of independence, as with WHO, and a liberation of some of these agencies so that they weren't so beholden to the checkbooks from national governments, but also therefore the politicalization from national governments. And that's why Wilmot's idea of a quasi-independent endowment or something similar through the World Bank or the IMF, I think is actually an attractive place. But I doubt if governments would be willing to release them to allow them to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Wilmot, I think you were about to say something, please.
Yeah, so I was going to build on the earlier conversation Wafaa had with Jeremy about global institutions, and wanted to just find out from Jerry what he thinks of the following, of establishing a rapid response entity that sits between the United Nations, the Secretary General's office, and the WHO, so that there can be rapid investigations into outbreaks and the rapid response, and to cascade that down so that, for example, the work we've been doing with the Africa Center for Disease Control can do with a rapid response agency, and then it's cascaded down to a regional level as well. That's a very focused effort. It's not a dissipated effort, it's coordinated, but it's essentially to improve the world's ability to respond quickly, given the scientific progress we've made.
Yeah, I think the world's ability to respond quickly critically depends on the infrastructure and capacity one has before one needs to respond. So the most important thing, you know, it's no surprise that Vietnam, Korea, Singapore, Norway, you know, have done very well in this. They were able to act quickly. They had prior experience in Korea's case and Vietnam's case, and indeed Singapore's case. They had very strong public health systems, very strong primary care, and a lot of capacity on their clinical side, and frankly, good political decision making. And Korea learned a lot of lessons from the outbreak of MERS. So I think I'm a great believer that if you want to prepare for pandemics, put in place something that has utility all of the time. Isn't just waiting there for a pandemic, but is actually providing benefits to the society today, tomorrow, the next week. When everyone's forgotten about a pandemic, they're still providing utility, whether for cancer in health or for TB or HIV. I think those infrastructures are so critically important. I think then the idea on top of that is the number one priority, to have a rapid identification of something happening and then a rapid response. Personally, I would uplift and I would empower the WHO to do that. But I think the regional bodies, the Africa CDC and the sub-regional bodies below the level of Africa CDC, and I'm pleased for PEPFAR that John Nkengasong is going to PEPFAR, wonderful. It leaves a hole at Africa CDC, and I know some of the talented people at Africa CDC, and leadership is so important at the Africa CDC, and I wish John well, and I wish John's successor well at the Africa CDC. But I think we need those sorts of structures at the regional level, Africa CDC, but also pay tribute to your colleagues in South Africa, Wilmot, and Chikwe in Nigeria, at the Nigerian CDC. National public health authorities are absolutely critical, feeding then into regional authorities and then plugged into the global commons. And I think WHO has a really important role still to play in the glue that binds those regional and national bodies together.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to one or two questions, but let me invite Wafaa to comment further. I could see you responding to the regional initiatives concept, and you may want to comment further.
Yeah, I think I do think that, I mean, I don't think we're disagreeing, all of us, but I do think that having a locus of action that's closer to where the action needs to happen is always of great value. And maybe it is about trying to empower these regional entities that then would take on a much more of a visible role in articulating what the priorities are and articulating the response. I think that is much more likely to be effective than a Geneva-based institution, for example. Yeah.
Absolutely agree.
So if I may, I'll just bring in a question or two from our audience. And one question asks, in thinking about unpreparedness, how much of our unpreparedness comes from the fact, you think, that, you know, previous diseases were thought to be pandemic, but did not turn out to be? H1N1, mad cow, Zika virus, Ebola. I mean, this is going to be an ongoing challenge. And how do you think about that problem? You lived through a number of those.
Yeah, I think all of those actually, in one way or another, as I'm sure many on this call have. It's a real challenge, the boy that cried wolf syndrome, or the child that cried wolf syndrome, if it translates across the Atlantic. All I'll say is, if the greatest fear is to underreact. Margaret Chan suffered at the WHO because she was criticized because she underestimated the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which tragically led to 11,000 people losing their lives. You've got to be prepared and thick-skinned enough to overreact occasionally, because underreacting is a disaster, as we've shown in COVID in the first quarter of 2020. And I think the boy that cried wolf syndrome, I think, is bedeviling us in how we address climate change. I think it's bedeviling how we address the rise of non-communicable diseases globally, or inequality, or indeed pandemics or drug resistance. People want to put it away because it's too hard to think about, and it probably won't happen tomorrow. So let's focus on today's challenges. And I think that's a political and an intellectual real challenge. How do we prepare for the future, which we know is going to happen, but we don't know when. But if it were to happen, would be disastrous. And I think people in positions of leadership have just got used to having a thick skin and overreacting occasionally. I was in Mexico in 2009 when the pandemic of H1N1 looked awful. And people were criticized for overreacting. I much prefer people to occasionally overreact than underreact. And on the second one, if you want me to take that from Neville on the question, SARS-CoV-1 was controlled, SARS-CoV-2 was not. The asymptomatic spread and the viral dynamics with the identifiable features. Please comment on whether widespread and early availability of rapid testing is feasible to limit. Yeah, the Cinderella, sorry, too many childhood legends, and which may not translate very well, but the Cinderella of all of the tools that we've talked about, one of them is testing. Even if you're in a wonderful hospital in New York, the number of people with a severe respiratory pneumonic illness who get a definite diagnosis is small. And most of the world, it's close to zero. If we could do one thing out of this, it would be to enhance and improve the availability and quality of diagnostic testing and sharing that information more rapidly. I think that would, in both the animal and human sector, because at the moment our diagnostic testing in most of the world is non-existent, and even in the rich world, for certain things, including infections of the lungs, infections of the brain, and septicemia, remains woefully inadequate, I think. And that's where I would like to see a lot of technological advances in the coming days, weeks, and years, and then to make that accessible and available globally.
Well, thank you very much. Let me ask you, I suppose, for the non-scientists like myself, we wonder whether there is enough science and investment occurring now in response to future variants, whether we can make that investment now, and whether enough is being marshaled in those directions globally. Would you offer a perspective on that?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic on this than maybe some others will be. I think if we could get vaccination around the world to the coronavirus strain, there will be new variants, no doubt, especially if we allow high transmission in high population countries. There will be new variants. But I would be more optimistic that natural immunity and vaccination will still offer some protection against these variants. What we need to do, and this is investments through things like SEPI and in industry and elsewhere, is to make sure we don't stop with the current vaccines, that we do develop second and third generation vaccines, which will longer lasting, provide better mucosal immunity so that they actually prevent transmission between people. They may be able to be given once for many years or for long term, and they can be given with other vaccination. It's very difficult to have every vaccine be given specifically for one disease in a public health system. So I think the second and third generation vaccines will be longer lasting. There'll be more protection against transmission, and they'll be able to be multiplexed with other vaccines that are given so that we can provide protection against the beta coronaviruses generally. That's where I believe science needs to take us. And governments can't just outsource that only to the private sector. Governments have got to step in and say, this is what we need, and we're going to fund it because we want it delivered, and not leave it, because otherwise the private sector, which deserves great credit through this pandemic in many, many ways, may actually be tempted by the thought of an annual vaccine to everybody. We'll be stuck where we are with the influenza vaccines a little bit.
Well, I thank you so much, Jeremy. This is, first of all, congratulations on this book. I'm very grateful for the chance to have this conversation with you and my distinguished colleagues. I think the issues that have surfaced are all ones that we as an institution want to be thinking about, are thinking about, and trying to marshal our knowledge and experience to take out into the world. So we hope to keep the conversation with you alive and congratulate you on all that you're doing. So thank you.
No, it's been a tremendous pleasure, and I look forward to being on campus again, and I look forward to growing partnership between Columbia and Wellcome and colleagues around the world. We face some big challenges, but science and underpinning of intellectual thinking is going to play a critical role. So a great pleasure and honor to join you.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure. Thank you, Wafaa. Thank you, Wilmot, James.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks
Thanks
Wafaa.
very much.